from Capital Research Center. Now, you guys have done extremely diligent work, kind of drilling down on whether it's Arabella Advisors, where the problem is so much bigger than just the trope of George Soros. You have a great news story, particularly when it comes to the campaign for court reform, basically court packing, walking through the kind of left-wing financiers and ties to the Harris campaign behind all this. Can you walk us through your news story?
Yeah, sure. It's a new story, but in a lot of ways, it's also an old story. It's a profile of a group that some might have heard of, some might not, called Demand Justice. It's what we like to call a dark money group or a 501c4 advocacy organization. And what Demand Justice did, many of your listeners might remember during the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. Brett Kavanaugh's name was dragged through the mud needlessly and baselessly for weeks on end in the media. The ringleader of that entire media circus was Demand Justice. They had protesters out in the halls of Congress dressed as people from The Handmaid's Tale. They were pressuring Susan Collins and trying to get her to flip her vote. They bought website domain stopkavanaugh.com. And all of this, at the time, Demand Justice was a fiscally sponsored project, or kind of a pop-up front organization of the 1630 Fund, which is, of course, the largest dark money 501c4 that the left has, and is controlled by the Arabella Advisors Network, which is the largest dark money network in the world, period. They raise over $1 billion a year and direct almost all of that money to far-left political causes, a lot of it done through these fiscally sponsored project pop-up groups. Demand Justice has since then spun off, and just after the catastrophic debate performance that I think everyone agreed was not optimal from Joe Biden, the Demand Justice group jumped in and announced a $10 million ad campaign specifically focused on discrediting and undermining the Supreme Court. They're going to try, and they have been trying for a very long time, to make court packing, or expanding the Supreme Court with an arbitrary number of justices, a mainstream issue instead of the radical fringe issue it once was. It is now the mainstream party platform, as President Joe Biden came out and announced that he's supporting term limits, which is just a de facto way of packing the Supreme Court. And it all goes back to the dark money donors behind this not liking the way the court rules.
And can you walk us through some of the ties, like you were saying? This is mainstream Democratic politics, right? Some of the people involved have very high-level roles now in the Harris campaign.
Exactly. So Demand Justice, back in its heyday, was created by a guy named Brian Fallon. If that name sounds familiar to any of you, he's had a lot of jobs in Democratic politics. He started out on the John Kerry presidential campaign, then moved over to be a campaign communications director for Bob Menendez, of all people. He scrubbed that from his LinkedIn. He doesn't want people to know that. Then he moved on, was with Chuck Schumer for nearly a decade as his lead communications director. And then he moved over to Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016 as the press secretary. After that, he moved over and created Demand Justice. And since then, Demand Justice, of course, made all of the Supreme Court confirmations into media circuses and has made court packing into a mainstream political issue for the Democratic Party and the left. But since then, he has left Demand Justice. What is his new job? Well, it's the head of communications for then Vice President Kamala Harris, but he has now become the head of a presidential campaign after Joe Biden withdrew very suddenly. I would say the timing of a guy with Brian Fallon's credentials moving from his own pet dark money group to become the head of a vice president's communications campaign, it didn't make sense at the time. After Biden withdrew, it started making a lot more sense, especially since one of his other old bosses he was the head of PR for Eric Holder during the peak of all of his scandals, Fast and Furious, and contempt of Congress. Eric Holder, just the other day, we found out, was the guy who vetted all of Kamala Harris's VP candidates, and then presumably okayed Tim Walz. It was a very suspicious move at the time, I noticed, and I wrote this in my report. It didn't make a lot of sense, but it makes a lot of sense now. I want to know what Brian Fallon knew and when he knew it about the likelihood that Biden would withdraw from the campaign and that he'd find himself suddenly promoted to the head of a presidential campaign against Trump for the second time in his life.
With all the happy talk that we hear from these people about how important democracy is, while they're of course pushing lawfare, would you say that it is a fair charge to say that a lot of this dark money stuff, this manipulation of campaign financing, I think compounded on the other side of the coin with the sort of weird Act Blue stuff, the money laundering stuff that we've been starting to uncover, that this is in and of itself sort of another form of financial lawfare, right? The way that they're playing these legal kind of shell games with these organizations, these entities masquerading as bipartisan or independent when in reality they're not. Can you sort of walk the audience through the larger network that is Arabella Advisors, how this is so much bigger than just, the one-off that is George Soros?
Yeah, absolutely. So Demand Justice is just one of the organizations that Arabella has created to attack the Supreme Court. Another organization by the name of Fix the Court, which I exposed for having major problems with its campaign or with its IRS tax disclosures, even though its main purpose is to advocate for more disclosure from the Supreme Court. Fix the Court and Demand Justice were both, turning all of our Supreme Court nomination processes into a complete media circus with wild speculation. And at the core of it is this Arabella Advisors organization, of course, even though it looks like there may be 10, 11, 12 different organizations all advocating, and supposedly there's broad public support for something like Supreme Court term limits or Supreme Court financial disclosures or ethical regulation bodies that are somehow controlled by Congress. They're using the guise of concern for transparency and ethics, even though they're using very non-transparent methods to fund and advocate for all of these things. So they're very focused, supposedly, on the idea of transparency, ethics, and disclosure, while not doing any of that themselves. And the reality is they couldn't care any less about ethics, transparency, or disclosure. If you want proof of that, just look back the last 10 years before Demand Justice came onto the scene. No one was writing any stories about, Clarence Thomas's trips or anything like that, even though those were already in the news. It's just people weren't concerned about that because we trust our Supreme Court system. We trust our constitutional system of government. The sudden concern is simply because the court has started making rulings that the left does not like. And so they're reaching for any weapon they can to attack the Supreme Court, and Arabella Advisors provided those weapons tenfold.
And do you see any meaningful pushback, whether through legislation or whatever, coming from Republicans in a variety, whether it's elected officials, grassroots? What do you see?
Yeah, people who are committed to the Constitution, who like the system that the founders set up, in which the Supreme Court is one of the three main branches of government. People who are constitutional conservatives have been speaking up about this. They've been writing op-eds. They've been exposing the fact that these media smear campaigns against the Supreme Court are coordinated by one or two or three or four common donors using a handful of different organizations. People are calling for the Supreme Court to get more protection after a failed assassination attempt. I think it's been really healthy for the country. The response to this smear campaign, it hasn't worked, but it's going to continue. And with Demand Justice arming up another $10 million to try and discredit the Supreme Court, it's going to be a battle that has to keep being fought.
And do you think, I'm just curious, in looking at this, is this something that is unique to the left? In other words, is the MAGA kind of faction of the right wing, when they say that, we're anti-democracy, do we fund our elections, our groups like that, or is it more genuinely grassroots?
No, there are certainly conservative judicial advocacy organizations that do a lot of great work. And many of those organizations are doing a really good job of holding the left-wing groups that are telling lies about the Supreme Court accountable. So I think it's one of those battles that conservatives are there are a lot of things that conservatives are not good at doing, particularly with the more less grassroots, more donor-influenced parts of political advocacy. But the conservatives are very good, I think, and doing a great job so far of trying to protect the Supreme Court from existential threats.
And Parker, if people want to follow you, read more of your reporting, where can they go to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Twitter/X at Parker Thayer. You can also check out capitalresearch.org, capital spelled with an A, not an O, where we post new content every day exposing dark money groups, nonprofits getting involved in elections. We did lots of work on CTCL, which your excellent previous guest, Logan Washburn, mentioned. We cover it all. If the left does it, we cover it. So check us out at capitalresearch.org as well.
I'm sure no shortage of content. Parker, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you.